Good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this day number 3 of the training session for patients, consumers, and healthcare professionals involved in medicines regulatory activities. My name is Michael Berntgen. I'm heading here at EMA the Scientific Evidence Generation Department, but I'm also coordinating our engagement from EMA side with other decision makers, such as HTA bodies. And that's also the particular relationship with today's training, which I'm super excited about, I can tell you. It's great to have so many participants here in this meeting. We had around 60 registered participants from the patients, healthcare professionals side. And this is really also testament to this topic being of wider interest. And as Maria was just saying, there had been some additional colleagues been added to this session because they hadn't had a chance to hear this before, simply because this is the very first time we have HTA Corporation or HTA activities, I should better say, as part of this training session. Now, allow me to just briefly say why we at EMA yeah, said, well, it would be great to have such training also as part of this portfolio. I think it's really down to the simple fact that we all know if we want to think about patient access to medicines, and be it innovative medicines, be it established medicines, there is a decision-making chain. And yes, there is the regulatory decision, but then there's other decisions to be made before this medicine reaches the patients ultimately, in the respective healthcare systems. And a very important part of this decision-making chain is, of course, health technology assessment. So one could say there is an ecosystem of decision makers who will then need to see that the medicine travels from one to the other, because everybody of these decision makers has their specific remits. So with this in mind, and looking at healthcare professionals and patients who are the ultimate beneficiaries also of these medicines once there is access, it's important for those colleagues to really understand, be familiar with this decision-making chain, and to see how and where to get involved. That's maybe the context. So with the objective of this particular training to really understand also where we are with medicines regulation, but then getting the hands-on approach where you can get consulted, and then getting an overview of the HTA processes. This is something which we try to see and explore with you in the next few hours. So, with all this being said, and not talking for too long, I'm extremely excited, as you may see already. And I'm extremely grateful to colleagues from EUnetHTA, who have made not only themselves available, but who have put this together for us here today. EUnetHTA is the European Network for Health Technology Assessment. It's the consortium currently, EUnetHTA 21. Colleagues will introduce themselves in a second. I'm working very closely with all the 4 of them, with Anna, with Maggie, with Stephanie, with Daniel. So I'm know them well, and I know that they will deliver an excellent training to all of you, which you can really look forward to. I should also say from the outset a big thanks to Maria, as you know, the master of this event, for bringing us all together and really for making this all happen. In fact, having the initial idea to bring this up on the agenda today. So really, really big thanks. As you see in the agenda, it's going to be in 2 parts today. First, we're going to have an introduction to health technology assessment with some presentations from the colleagues from EUnetHTA 21. And then subsequently, we have breakout sessions, one for patients, one for healthcare professionals, to really go in depth into the training, as you all know from these sessions. So, with all this being said, very much looking forward to the next few hours. Thanks to everybody for putting this together, and enjoy the training.
Thank you very much, Maria. Um, so We start with the slides on abbreviations use, and I encourage you all to make a picture of it just so that you have it when we are presenting. We will do our best really to speak all abbreviations in full, but should we forget, please type it in the chat and we will clarify it there. And just as a reminder, we also shared one of the supporting documents, which was a glossary, and you may also find some definitions of the terms there. So that might also be helpful after this presentation to have a look through again. But just I'm giving here a few more seconds so people can have a quick read or make a picture. But as I said, we will do our best to speak it in full, but EUnetHTA really is a landscape of abbreviation, so please do point it out in case we forget. Okay, then I think we can move to the next slide, and we can move another one because as Michael said, we start with an introduction on what HTA is, so Health Technology Assessment. And for that, I always like to compare it to what regulators do so that we get a better overview of the different remits there. And I think you know very well what regulators do, also given the previous trainings you've had before. But we just sum it up very black and white to get the message across of the different remits here. So the regulators, or the European Medicine Agency, if we're being specific today, they have an authorization focus. So they look at the efficacy, safety, and quality of the drug. So if we translate that into questions, it would be, does technology X work? Does the benefit of technology X outweigh the risks? And is technology X of sufficient quality? They also can look at any additional needs for the technology X post licensing. So that's the remit of regulators. Again, very black and white. For HTA, as is in the name, Health Technology Assessment, it is assessment focused. And there we look at the benefit in comparison to the current standard treatment. So if we would reflect that into questions, it would be, how does technology X compare to technology Y? And then technology Y being the standard we already have for the practice we have in the countries. So we look at whether technology X is better than what we already have and in what way it is better. So does it have fewer harms? Under what circumstances may it be better? And is there maybe a specific patient population it may be better in? Now, this first part really is the assessment part. So that's more or less objective. And on that second point, that's where it says put into national context. And that is where, to me, the appraisal begins. So that's, again, a new term. I'm aware of that. But that means more the decision making. And with that, they put the first bullet point, so more the objective summary, they put that into context and into perspective, and they look at whether other things need to be considered as well. So the question there can be, is it worth paying for? And that then can be, do we need to follow up maybe with a cost effectiveness assessment? Are there any ethical aspects to consider, or any organizational or very specific patient aspects to consider in our country? It's worth mentioning here that the decision-making process is different in each country. So not each health technology assessment body does decision making. Some countries have it in the Ministry of Health. Some countries just have a separate committee. So that really depends on the member state. And also not every country does the cost effectiveness analysis. So that's very good to keep in mind. We will share a bit more information, I think, about what we do in EUnetHTA, but in summary, we only focus on clinical assessments if we're speaking about that term. And in the national autonomy, the decision-making stage. So we are not giving any conclusions on reimbursement in any of our assessments. Thank you. So if we then look at the current situation in Europe, I'm also again comparing regulatory side versus the health technology assessment side. And we see on the left, the EMA. There's of course one single licensing system based on one European legislation. And that means there are very well-defined and agreed assessment criteria. So there's one common system in Europe. If we look at the HTA side, at the moment, it's very national. And every member states have different systems for health technology assessment, and some may even have multiple systems in their countries. So it can be very regionalized even. This means it's based on national legislations and procedures, and that of course leads then to that there are different methodologies and different assessment criteria. And that is a bit problematic because all of the methodology or medicines need to be assessed rather at the same time. So there's a lot of duplication in work. So if we can just move one slide. I want to show where we're going towards to with the upcoming HTA regulation. So I'll explain about the regulation in a little bit more detail in one of the next slides, but the regulation means that there is a European law, if I can put it that way. So for the EMA, it stays the same, but you can now see that there are two blocks for HTA. So yellow now is the HTA regulation. It's a European regulation. It supersedes national law, meaning that every country now has to change and move to the joint HTA work as under the regulation. So this will lead to a common methodology and a more common approach for joint scientific consultations and joint clinical assessments. And as I also just pointed out with the introduction of the concept, then it moves to the gray block, so to the national uptake of it. So the joint clinical assessments then, once they have been made on a European level, can be used nationally for decision making. So then each member state can put their additional arguments or their additional questions in and make a decision or a conclusion. But also for the scientific consultations, national consultations still are possible. So then you've heard the term HTA regulation before, so let's just dive into that a little bit more detail and also on the key products. The slide I'm showing now has been provided by the European Commission, and I'm aware it's quite complex and quite detailed, but I think it's helpful to have an overview there. So the regulation was adopted in December 2021. And it entered into force in January 2022. That it entered into force doesn't mean it's applied just yet. So the HTA regulation will only be applied as of January 2025. So we're now in that preparatory phase, or the yellow block there. And as you can see, there are quite some things that still need to be developed, either from the European Commission side, for example, setting up the stakeholder network, but also some content work still needs to be delivered. And that is where EUnetHTA 21 comes in, and I'll give some more details on that later. But it basically means that we now help defining the contents of certain implementing acts and guidance documents, so that we can facilitate the implementation of the regulation. As of January 2025, then the regulation really will be applied. But as you can see, it's not into the full scope just yet. So that also takes a few years. As of 2025, the joint scientific consultations start running. But for the joint clinical assessments, there is a build-wise step up, stepwise build up, I must say. And we start with cancer drugs and ATMPs. And then as of January 2028, also orphan drugs will be added to the scope. And as of 2030, the full scope is applied for joint clinical assessments, meaning that all medicines that will be authorized by the EMA also fall under the scope of the HTA regulation. So on that, we can move to the next slide. So what is EUnetHTA 21? You've heard the term quite a few times now before. We are a service contract for the Commission, and we support the implementation, as I said before, of the HTA regulation. All our output is joint output. So all consortium members we have currently from 12 different member states in Europe, they all have a say in all the deliverables. And with that, we ensure it really is the EUnetHTA voice of our deliverables. And the focus for us is on developing those methodological guidelines, transversal guidelines, for example, on conflicts of interest, but also patient and clinical expert input, templates. You will hear more about it in the breakout sessions, and procedures, with the aim, as I said, to facilitate the implementation for the regulation, but also for us to help conduct these joint products that are so important. So the joint scientific consultations and joint clinical assessments. Should you wish to know more, there's a link on this slide so you can find all the deliverables we are working on, and even the published ones if they're available just yet. So if we can, yes, thank you. So the key products under the regulation, and I picked just a few because for HTA there's a range of activities you can do, but I'm just focusing on joint scientific consultations and joint clinical assessments today, because that will also be the focus in the breakout rooms. So joint scientific consultations is scientific advice provided jointly by HTA bodies to the manufacturers on the clinical development. And it needs to be noted that this can also be in parallel with regulators. And the aim there is that to generate evidence that satisfies also the needs of HTA bodies during the assessment and ultimately facilitates patient access. The joint clinical assessment is a joint HTA report on the clinical domains, but also produced by multiple European member states. In the joint clinical assessment, we are not giving any conclusions on added value or reimbursement. As I said before, that remains within the autonomy of the member state, but it's a clinical summary of the evidence available. And this is aiming to avoid the duplication of work at the national level, to increase consistency, quality of the assessment, and also here ultimately to facilitate patient access. So if we then just look at where those HTA products on the European level would come in, and maybe you can click one more time, Marie. I think we have a pop-up here. And one more, sorry. Thank you. So on this slide, I'm trying to show the life cycle of the drug development. So you see that on the left, so it starts with research to market authorization, price and reimbursement, and prescription behavior. And for the first two blocks, that is then where the centralized market authorization process at EMA lies. And the second block is then the national pricing and reimbursement process in the member states. So the joint scientific consultations, as I said before, they aim to support the development and the relevant evidence is being gathered. So that takes place in the research phase, and it needs to be conducted before any pivotal trial is being set up. The joint clinical assessment would take place on the second orange block to the right side, so on the relative effectiveness assessment. It is, especially for medicinal products, it is rather in parallel to the regulatory process, because our assessment starts at positive CHMP opinion. So there's a little bit more overlap than this figure shows. But it is to be noted, it really is only on that comparative effectiveness, so the relative effectiveness part, and then the national member states still need to add in their other criteria and measures they need before they make any conclusions on reimbursement. And then I would like to show just very briefly the process. We will also discuss these extensively in the breakout sessions. So you can ask all the questions you have in the breakout sessions. We will do that both for the patients and as well for the clinical expert. So for the joint scientific consultations, and we're explaining here the process within EUnetHTA 21, so not necessarily what is laid down under the regulation, although it would be rather similar. It starts all with the development of a briefing book. So first there needs to be an application and selection of candidates. After that, there will be the manufacturer submitting the draft briefing book. HTA bodies then review that, they give back their feedback, and that leads to a final briefing package. And if you click one more time, we have another arrow popping up. That ends the process for the actual written recommendations for the joint scientific consultations. And the process for that second arrow takes roughly 3 months. And it starts with the HTA bodies to evaluate the briefing book, and that leads to them sharing a list of issues to the manufacturer. The manufacturer, so that's here the HTD, the health technology developer, then submits a written response based on that. And this is followed then by a meeting between the EMA, the HTA bodies, and the health technology developer. And finally, that leads to the final written recommendations from the HTA body side. If we move to the next one, I'm showing rather similar figures, but then for the joint clinical assessment in EUnetHTA 21. And we start here with a scoping phase, as we call it. So that starts with identifying a topic, leading to creating an assessment team, and then most importantly about defining the scope and the PICO. PICO stands for Patient Population Intervention Compared to an Outcome, and we will explain this extensively in the breakout session. But this is also the point in time where patients and clinical experts could be involved, and also the manufacturer needs then to submit a dossier based on our PICO requirements. If you click one more time, the arrow for the assessment phase pops up, and also here the assessment phase takes roughly 3 months from first draft to the public consultation. As I said before, for joint clinical assessment, the first draft only officially starts once there is a positive CHMP opinion. So the scoping phase really takes place before that's really in parallel also with the regulatory pathway. After first draft, all HTA bodies will do a review. That will lead to updating on the second draft, etc. And then there will be a factual accuracy check by the industry. So they can check if we cited everything correctly that they submitted. And once the report is finalized, it will be published, and that can then be followed by the member state appraisal and reuse nationally. Again, we will explain this in much more detail in the breakout. As Michael said, we also have collaboration with the EMA, also foreseen under the regulation, but also within EUnetHTA 21. And this is just to quickly highlight where those collaborations could be. So they could be on the horizon scanning or the identification of emerging technologies, but also on the joint scientific consultation and the joint clinical assessment. And any details on how that collaboration should exactly be need to still be defined, and they will be defined through those implementing acts. So if you can move to the next, thank you. I'm just showing very briefly the work plan we have currently under EUnetHTA 21 and EMA. On this side is also a link where you can find more details. And all the topics on the work plan are listed on this slide, but I'm just only focusing on one, and it's really in the middle of the slide, the methodologies for engagement of patients and healthcare professionals. So that's also why we are part of the training today, and we have a continuous interaction so that we can learn from both sides on how best practices are to, for example, recruit patients and healthcare professionals, but also best practices to involve them. So that is in a nutshell the introduction for health technology assessment. And I'm happy to take any clarifying questions now, or we can also save them for in the breakout sessions.